I think we are live. Okay. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Queerlins, welcome to our very first interview. I'm Chris, and I'm a co-editor with Ro for the non-fiction submissions in the journal. We've just released issue 4, and so please do check out the material in there. And I'm joined today, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be joined by Dr. Paul Simpson, a senior lecturer in sociology at Manchester University, to discuss ageism in the queer community, with a particular focus on the gay scene and gay men. I'm just going to introduce the sort of outline and the reasons why this is a sort of a very important issue, and then we're just going to crack on, and Paul's kindly offered to answer some questions that I had. So the impetus and motivation for this interview have arisen out of a discursive proliferation of self-directed imagery that is self-consciously promoted on social media networking sites. Concurrently, there is a notable and very explicitly rendered ageism, or what has been articulated as an ageist erotophobia. Such erotophobia refers to the apparent decline and withering away of sexual desire and sexual desirability of those over a certain age, when they are colloquially referred to as past it, or what has been constructed academically as post-sexual, that is, excluded from the socio-sexual citizenship. And I quote some phrases that Paul's used here. The disjunctive and marked separation between a youth-centered landscape and an ostracized, aging queer community in later life is something that has incited my own interest in this area of aging and ageism. However, this isn't just an academic interest for me. It's something that I'm becoming increasingly aware of and sensitive to as I edge my way closer to the dreaded 40. I'm 32, and I've developed a very acute receptivity towards any physical signs of aging I can detect, and a hypervigilance towards how I am now seen or read in queer spaces, such as Queen's Court in Leeds or Canal Street in Manchester. And I am, in the back of my head, held hostage by this burden of representation. That is the idea that there are gay years, inverted commas, that these are a measure and a marker of what has been referred to as, quote, accelerated aging cultures. I think that perhaps this issue of how one looks, that is, how youthful one can appear, is most certainly exacerbated by the normalization of narcissism and the attendant validation, reward, and punishment for such self-conscious exhibitionism that has both enabled, and I would argue been sustained by, social networking sites such as Instagram, as well as dating apps such as Grindr and Tinder, whose primary user orientation is based on a response to people precisely as aestheticized objects of desire. That is, an image which is primarily a vector of signification, and their biography or identity is somehow sat on the sidelines. And I call this hypervisuality within queer spaces that affect and determine how oneself presents, self-constructs, and how one is read and assessed by others, by spectators, by people in bars. And this really unsettles me in both a spiritual and a physical sense. It's also why I've done some digging around into studies that investigate such an accelerated aging culture within the gay scene and other queer spaces. And this is how I found out about the important work that has been and continues to be conducted by Dr. Paul Simpson. Paul has a PhD in sociology and has lectured at several universities in the Northwest and is currently a lecturer in sociology at the University of Manchester. He has published extensively on gay male aging, disadvantaged men, and health and sexuality and intimacy in later life. He has had articles published in Aging in Society, these are the journals, the British Journal of Sociology, Men and Masculinities, Qualitative Research, Sociological Research Online, Sociological Review, Sociology of Health and Illness, among others. So quite a wealth. His most recent series is entitled Sex and Intimacy in Later Life, which was co-edited by Paul Reynolds and Trish Harfer-Letchfield. And I hope I pronounced Trish's name right there. This is a copy of the book. I'd recommend everybody buy this immediately. It's a great book. However, today we're going to focus on something that I've recently been reading, which was Paul's monograph published in 2015. Is that right, Paul? Yeah,
correct.
That's good. I've got the date right. Entitled "Gay Men, Aging and Ageism Over the Rainbow." This book, as Paul will no doubt elaborate upon, it examines the midlife gay man's experience of growing older in Manchester, the LGBT capital of the north of England. It does this in order to ask, and I'm quoting from the book, can middle-aged men expect little more than rejection and isolation as they slide towards the ultimate misery represented by the epithet lonely old queen? This book feels more relevant to me the older that I get, and with the aforementioned landscape of visual exteriority, feels astutely appropriate and absolutely pressing. There's a brilliant quote that Paul uses that introduces the entire book, which I believe is worth quoting at length to sort of set the scene and establish the context for this discussion. So this is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, this is a quote from Tony, who's 59, who said, "I've had younger men ask me on the dance floor, 'What the hell are you doing here? This place isn't for you. This place isn't for old men.' Most of these young people, when they see people like us, or me rather, they see their own fathers. They don't expect to find their parents or even their grandparents at the same disco, do they?" And like I said, that was a quote from Tony, 59. So I think that's more than enough introduction. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity, Paul. It's great to have you here. I'd offer you a coffee, but a virtual gesture might have to suffice for now. And I think we're going to go straight in with the questions, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, fine.
Brilliant. So, yeah, the painfully ambiguous question, I guess, is could you provide an outline of your research? Maybe perhaps define some terms as well, or give a general overview of what you do and why you do it, I guess.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for such a generous introduction, and how will I live up to it? But yeah, and thanks for giving a really neat encapsulation of my work. And just one thing before I do start to outline, and I hear the story, the dominant story of rejection and misery and all the rest of it, but I want to register that in what we're going to do today, but also to recognise that there are other stories that are being told that can sometimes get hidden by that dominant story of woe is me, isn't it terrible, and I'm being rejected, and so on and so forth. So there are other kind of more recuperative, perhaps life-affirming stories available, and a lot of ambivalent ones in between those two poles as well. So that is probably a key message. Well, in terms of an outline, obviously it's about middle-aged gay men in a particular milieu, a particular city. Manchester has a very developed, quite long-standing, going back years and years, and a very colourful and a very differentiated LGBT culture. I mean, a lot of it is focused around men. Historically, that's been the case because of their economic capital, at least, and probably the esteem that attaches to masculinity and so on. I just thought it would be really useful to have a look at what's going on here in terms of aging. This major story. We might even regard it as the major division that fragments the gay scene or gay cultures. So I thought it'd be interesting to look into that. And basically, I thought, well, I'd like to get the in-depth stories, the personal stories, through in-depth interviews. But I thought also, wouldn't it be interesting to get the stories that are told pre-consciously or subconsciously through the body that are a bit less censored. So I didn't do an ethnography because I wasn't immersed in the culture. I didn't become part of the life, as it were. I didn't adopt the role of a bartender or a busboy. So I mean, I need, I have a life. I needed a tactical retreat from it so I could process what was going on. So it was very much participant observation. But nonetheless, I did 20 participant observation sessions to get a sense of the life and what was going on in Canal Street and beyond, in terms of how middle-aged gay men were being addressed or interpolated or understood, read. and all the rest of it. So I thought it'd be interesting to combine those two methods of in-depth interviews to get the personal stories, but also to get the embodied, less self-conscious stories that were told through dancing, relating to others, hamming it up. You know, the whole kind of rich kind of culture that you see when you go out and you start looking. You know, it's. I mean, sometimes I feel really uncomfortable on the scene if I'm there and waiting for those 15 minutes and they're late and they turn up and you think, oh, for that. But going with that permission that I was doing research and I was observing was really quite interesting, you know, and to have that role, that position, and to be able to look and to see things that you wouldn't normally be looking for. So that was my methods related, if you like. Methodologically, looking at, if you like, the philosophies and ideas that inform or underpin methods and our understandings, I actually used Foucault and the more agentic capacities within Foucault, things like tools like the ethics of the self, where you think strenuously on the relationship of the self to the self, to understand what's going on, not just within yourself but around you as well. It demands some kind of strenuous. I think it's Foucault in more humanistic mode, to be honest. It's Foucault the humanist rather than the post-humanist. But at the same time, I also wanted to ground, not just regard discourses and stories that we tell as free floating and just in the atmosphere, but as grounded in something. So I selectively, try to combine it with aspects of Bourdieu, the idea of fields of existence with their own tacit rules of the game that subtly animate and influence and shape what's going on in social and cultural spaces. So it was a discursive project. How does discourse work upon people? How does it animate people? But also let's ground it in something in concrete and actual spaces, and with all the attendant rules that may kind of influence what's going on in what's allowable, what's permissible, and even expected in different social spaces. So what I was trying to do there was to with that methodology was to recognize that social reality is complex, it's multiform, and not one single tool is good enough to understand everything that's going on in a very rich and complicated world. So I thought, well, let's use different tools to highlight, to bring to understand different dimensions of social reality. So that was my kind of methodological strategy. And I also, perhaps more concretely, I looked at not just at the gay scene. Manchester isn't, the gay life, gay existences are not just about the visible pubs and clubs or places where people congregate, and increasingly inhabited by heterosexual friends and allies and people and others these days. So, they're quite kind of mixed spaces. But I wanted to think about how ageism might work in different gay scenes, rather than looking at the gay scene as a homogenous thing or a whole, rather than reifying it. I wanted to regard it as a multiform process that's highly differentiated and has different spaces where, again, different rules of the game, different kind of fields of existence are in play, really. So, with that in mind, I didn't just look at the scene. I looked at behaviour in heterospaces, spaces that are understood as heterosexually dominated, but where gay people venture, and these days are maybe having a few more convivial relationships that are a bit more free from worries about homophobia and discrimination and hostility and violence and all the rest of it. But also, the hybrid spaces of created family and kinship that involve gay friends, lesbian friends, trusted heterosexually identified friends and relatives as part of the kind of family that exists sometimes on the scene, but off it as well. And what I noted was that, get to your 40s and people start to make this kind of move, or to reconfigure their kinship from the scene into a more familial and domestic kind of scene around this particular time. So it's the spaces of friendship and family, and as well as the homostasis, of social groups, social and support groups, and saunas, and the scene online, which is becoming ever more important. And I know you've got a question a little bit later on, but just to telescope my findings for you, they're very much what was the key message about gay aging from the point of midlife and ageism? Well, as ever, it's a complex story. It's a multiform one, and whilst there were quite a lot of evidence of capitulation to discourses of accelerated aging, and woe is me, I've lost sexual capital, I'm no longer desirable. There were stories of ambivalence in everyday practices, like, age is just a number, but I dye my hair a little bit at the temples just to hide the signs, or even use of Botox in some cases where, and you think Botox could be regarded as a really neoliberal vanity project, isn't it? About producing yourself in a particularly approved gay way and it was, in a sense, to look believably younger for as long as you could to sustain your sexual marketability. There was that element of it, but also at the same time, in those complex and very ambivalent stories was an excoriating critique of the discursivity of the gay scene that impels people to do this rather than to accept a more authentic, genuine aging self, and to prize and value aging rather than to try and avoid it at all costs or cover over the signs, the telltale incriminating signs of aging. So there was the complex, the ambivalent, and there was the downright resistant. I'm fat, over 40, I'm aging, I've got wrinkles, get over it. What Foucault calls reversals of discourse.
Yeah.
Where you that piggyback on the so-called dominant discourse, the negative stuff, and turn it around and say, well, hang on, there were people who were saying, well, actually, I find wrinkles erotic. So they were revaluing, resignifying practices that, well, actually, if you think about wrinkles, I look at a guy and I love that rugged and polished look that tells a tale about an interesting past, that this is somebody who might be sexually, those wrinkles might tell you something about sexual experience or knowledge of the world and accumulated knowledge of the gay scene and how to handle yourself, and confidence, which in itself can be very sexy. That confidence in yourself, regardless of your age, can be quite alluring. So there were all those kinds of reversals that used what we might call the resources of aging, accumulated knowledge of the self, of others, of relationships, of how things work in different social settings, different contexts, different fields of existence, that enabled, that were the prerequisite, that were the bedrock for people to be agentic and to say, and to give a more critical rendering of accelerated aging and gay ageism and the whole cargo, the whole weight of it, really. So three things: capitulation, ambivalence, and resistance, and they all existed in the same person. It wasn't just that one set of people were doing this, one set of people were doing. Although there were differences, of course. Maybe it was middle class men who were more likely to tell the story of, well, I think these other middle-aged men who go on the scene and try to look young, I think they're terrible. That shows that they're not accepting themselves. They're not being genuine. It's not genuine stuff. And that was a very class kind of narrative that came from a more educated middle class kind of person. But and it's tempting to think that working class men were perhaps without critique, but they weren't. They may have lacked so-called the educational credentials, the degrees and all the things that kind of validate our intelligence. But they were, in their own way, their language may have been slightly different. They would have spoken or expressed themselves in a different register, but they were the resources of aging enabled them to be quite critical of not just gay ageism, but also homophobia a whole lot more of political issues as well. So just my final point in terms of the findings was that I found how ageism was multi-directional. There's this tendency to think, oh, it's all against middle-aged elder gay men, isn't it? Well, it wounds, it hurts them more. They probably experience it more. It weighs more heavily on them. But there was this kind of reverse ageism where, men were using this notion of a more authentic gay self in midlife to criticise in a very ageist way younger gay men as shallow, insubstantial, immature, and all the rest of it. So they were quite capable of drawing on these kind of stereotypical discourses of younger gay men, but very much as kind of fighting back, but it maybe fighting back in a less constructive way, really. And rather than being critical of the discourse, very often they were critical of the people who were impelled or, being impelled by it, if you like. So, sorry, that's a rather long outline. I do apologise.
No, that was brilliant, really interesting. Obviously, you've covered a lot there. I think what kind of transpires from what you were talking about immediately to me is the agency and the control, where I guess before kind of coming to your work, I've looked at it as a sort of binary of, youth-centered, this is great, and then, age, and it's just like, it's all downhill type of thing. And it's like, it isn't a good and bad, it isn't an oscillation or a migration between these two fixed spaces. It's like there is an agency to construct a site of resistance and to, just basically own it. And like you said about the reverse discourse, Foucault and stuff. And, the idea that like the physicality of old age and wrinkles being erotic, it's almost like an embodiment and a reclaiming of, a rewriting of the space as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess it's not all bad.
It's more complex. It's a lot more nuanced than the binary allows. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yes, indeed. That's a very Thank you.
And also, I think I'm really interested what you said about the interdependence and the interrelationality, I guess, between. It isn't, like you say, a homogenous space where there's a uniform and it's a prescriptive. This is how you behave. This is how you act and perform. To a male gaze, if you like. It feels like much like Judith Butler talks about the social construction. This active piecing together from different parts. And I just wondered how you felt about representations in the media. And if that factors into this, because I was thinking about when you talk about Botox, there's a scene on Queer as Folk. I think the character Ted goes down this route of trying to, stay young forever. And I just wondered if from your research, any observations, or if there's anything that you noticed that maybe a participant said.
That's a good point. I think that's something that of course, you can't do everything in your research. You have to be selective. And inevitably, a lot falls on the cutting room floor. But that's a really good point you make, actually. And I think I might have mentioned it and acknowledged it as a possible influence. But maybe the mistake I made in terms of the book I wrote was that I perhaps underprivileged the influences of perhaps wider consumer culture. And of course, there are gay appropriations of it as well. You've only to open a gay magazine or a newspaper, and it is full of kind of beauty products or gym memberships, the usual kind of paraphernalia that seems attendant upon younger gay identity, if you like. So I think if I were going back to it, I would certainly want to look at how those perhaps the gay media in particular, but also general media, and how any kind of interaction between those two sets of influences, any dialogue, or how they both complexly, in different ways, perhaps shape or even feed off each other. Really, I think that's probably the sense of it, isn't it? But I think what you make me think there is that there may be pressures on younger and perhaps even middle-aged heterosexual men increasingly these days in this kind of mediatized and ever more consumer-focused.
Definitely. Capitalism's got a lot to answer for. I guess I was going to ask you about the motivations behind your research. If you want to, you've kind of alluded to it anyway, but
got a little bit to say, really, but I mean, I said a lot already, but I guess you hit on it at the beginning. The motive, the original motive, was quite personal, really. I'd begun to think I got to my 40s or thereabouts, and I just began to think, I'm being addressed or not addressed or even invisibilized. But you're being interpolated, you're being addressed or regarded or not regarded in particular ways. And I thought, what's wrong with me? I've got a bit older, and you start to ask yourself some kind of other prickly, judgmental questions about, oh God, is this payback time for all my own ageism when I was young? Old queens, is this about taking responsibility? Is this a reckoning? Am I that shallow that I'm still concerned about my looks? And should I not be something else? Should I not be focusing on making jam or get it involved? Retiring, what have you? But and I thought, well, hang on a minute, these personal questions are inevitably political, and it's start to think about, well, what are the wider politics of the scene? And so read a book. What does the literature say? What are people saying about this? And when I had thought, I'd been looking at literature anyway, and I just thought, well, when gay men are addressed, gay bisexual adults, they're either young, presumed young, or ageless. The scene figures very highly, which tends to attract a somewhat younger crowd. And the story of older gay men is all this, the misery story of the loss of connections, the loss of sexual capital, the loss of sexual opportunities, of isolation, of being disregarded in terms of friendship and kinship and so on. And of course, there's been some focus on the impact of mental health, self-esteem, and wider physical health, and why not? And I just thought, well, this is important stuff, and I really wouldn't want it to be without it, but there's something missing here. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, and I just thought, surely it's got to be more complex than the binary, or the misery alone. So that was my motive, really, and to think. Also, a lot of the literature was US based or Australian. Quite a bit of it, strangely enough, was actually quantitative. People had got surveys, asking people to rate how they were rated, or to tick a box from 1 to 10 on how you feel you're esteemed, how valued you think you, etc., etc. So I just thought there's a gap in the market. There's something has to be done here that probably gets at the detail and the contingencies and opens out some of the stereotypes. So that, as ever, was my motive. Plus the fact that I thought I live in Manchester. It's a golden opportunity to look at this scene that has grown up. Again, it's not just the bar scene, but a whole load of social and support groups and family constellations, or newer cultural spaces being developed with trusted heterosexual allies and all the rest of it. So wouldn't it be interesting to do something with this? And also, a lot of gay stuff, gay research has been focused on London. It's quite London centric. So let's, now that Manchester has arrived and developed, let's have a look at what's happening outside of London. I think London is a very special case because it's, I suppose geopolitically, it's seen as really quite dispersed, isn't it? It's a much bigger place, but whereas Manchester generally tends to be focused in this one main space. And I just thought it would be interesting to look at maybe Manchester as a case study of an example of a post-industrial city that has now developed a highly differentiated and variegated LGBT, queer scene, if you like. So that was really my motive.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting, and space is definitely significant, and Manchester as a site of expression and stuff, but also time. You mentioned there about time being really significant, and it reminded me of a phrase you used in your book. I think it's extended adolescence or prolonged adolescence or stuff. This idea of like there's a window, there's a fixed window of like you know, and then after that, it's like a cliff edge, isn't it? Like, that's it, done, you know, you're here. But yeah, I think, yeah, I just wanted to ask about, so this is just anecdotal, something that I heard, which made me laugh out loud on a train, if I'm honest. I've heard a lot of people 25 and over complain about being old. And then I thought, you know, I wanted to ask you, is ageism in the gay community, is it still an issue, inverted commas, as in, is it a problem? Or how do you see it now, since you did your research, these kind of things?
It's all a bit relative, isn't it? I remember, I'm going to name drop here, but being in my first gay club in Liverpool back in the late 1970s, and young Holly Johnson, unknown, probably about 16, 17, he was going to the clubs earlier. We got talking about this mutual friend of ours, and Holly was aghast that Frank was nearly 23.
Yeah.
And he, you know, I think if you remember complimenting me about, I was 20 at the time, he was about 17, and he said, "God, you look good for your age." You know, I thought, oh my God, you know. So the accelerated aging, I think, as you said before, is rather keenly felt. I mean, and it's a kind of theory that's been picked up since about the 90s. Originally coined by two Australian researchers who did quantitative research called Bennett and Thompson, but it's been a feature of consistent feature of findings, you know, or conclusions in research about the gay scene. Whether or not you look at age, it's been a significant factor, really. So it's still very much a problem, isn't it? I mean, some people get to 30 and they feel they've been dropped off that kind of cliff, really. It's a bit of a watershed, but. In my own research, I think the people began to feel that rejection perhaps a little bit more keenly from the age. I think it's run up to about 40. You know, that conventional cultural marker in, well, at least in Western post-industrial societies of middle age, really. And it was. I mean, my own feeling was turned out to be quite a common narrative that people are saying yes. People are beginning to see me and read me in quite a different way. That I've noticed the change and that thing about invisibility occurring, really. So that was kind of borne out by other people's experience. So you know, and it still is. I found that it's still a concern in all of the different spheres of existence, the gay fields of existence that. Or the gay cultural scenes, if you like, that I looked at in my research. It still has power to wound. It's still keenly felt by people that as a form of exclusion from sexual citizenship, I think, as you hinted before, as valid sexual status, but also from belonging and friendship. Because you occasionally hear of middle-aged and older gay men perhaps confident enough to strike up a conversation with a younger man in a pub or a club, and automatically it's interpreted as a chat up. It may well be, it may not be, but you know, nonetheless, a lot of older men were reporting that even the opportunities to kind of develop some kind of conviviality, some understanding, at least in the basis of a conversation, were rare with younger gay men, and that were and such opportunities of friendship and understanding were being denied both ways, really. But and it was keenly felt perhaps in the more commercial spaces of clubs, pubs, and saunas, where the gaze of the younger gay peer was seen as particularly harsh and rejecting, and but ditto kind of online, really, that where I think it's called something called the online disinhibition effect. Whereas if you were face to face with somebody, you might be a little bit more diplomatic. You might have these negative, you might be thinking these negative things, but you're a little bit more diplomatic when. Was it Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas? The human face has a particular demand on morality, doesn't it? You see something, I suppose, empathy. You see something alike, and it has a call on how you then treat people. And in terms of how you might show respect to the basic respect to them. But
Mhm.
people reported that rejection was even sharper
Mhm.
online, where people had put up profiles, and it was all about fragmented body parts, cock shots, and torsos and six packs, and that validated people as kind of rather oddly, as in my view, as kind of sexual beings. But one space where they did feel free from this harsh, ageist gay male gaze was generally in spaces that they created with trusted heterosexual friends and family. It's time off from gay ageism, and they said, I do not get this with younger heterosexual male and female friends or associates or people
That's
I know
interesting. Yeah.
or come into contact with. So that my loss of sexual capital is just not read. It's not understood. Doesn't register there, and I'm regarded as this more holistic being who is funny, has certain attributes, qualities, and consequently, there were more grounds for more convivial forms of relating and perhaps understanding that were just far less judgmental, really. But a big caveat here, and it goes back to this idea of there being a broader, richer palette of multiform palette of experience, really, and it's not the entire story, and we shouldn't allow it, I think, to hide a lot of the more the more positive things that are actually going on, like support, conviviality, and friendship by fellow middle-aged gay men as well. It's not all about bitchy and undermining and what have you. But there was the more positive, more ambivalent forms of expression and relating as well that challenge this notion that midlife and gay later life is all about this slide towards misery and rejection. Other things are happening, and also older gay men have developed the means over time, the resource of aging, to fight back, to resist, and to be critical in some very, very important ways. So let's not forget the resistance, the cumulative knowledge and resources, that sense of self that's been built up over time, that challenges gay ageism, homophobia, even classism, and a whole load of other, political, cultural, political issues that we meet on a day-to-day basis when we set forth out into society.
I think it's just what came through with what you talked about there, the idea of agency and not almost being subsumed and assimilated into this trajectory of a fixed narrative of what aging means, and having all these positive things like beloved, community, togetherness, and then it's like it is restorative in some senses, and I think messages like that are not entirely promoted in the mainstream media, in Attitude magazine and Gay Times. I'm just thinking about a figure like Tom Daly that would be there, or things like this that become the sort of archetype, if you like, or the standard, and then that's like the where you measure yourself around there. But I think just to something you mentioned about the idea of discussions in a space, maybe an older gay man approaching a younger gay man, and it just made me think about, because it's a sex-saturated space, and almost your sexual capital is a currency in that space and exchange and stuff.
Yes.
It's interesting actually in terms of like because something that always gets under my skin is when some of I don't mind being honest, some of my friends at my age will refer to the older predator and these horrible, really I think quite intrinsically toxic stereotypes. It's like that idea of it just being a conversation seems to be definitely not feasible. Like they're only in this space. I say they, as in the other. they're only in the space because it's sex. It's all about sex and stuff. So that was interesting. I think just something that I was dying to ask you was, what I find interesting is obviously a show like Pose has come out on TV recently, Billy Porter and whatnot, and it's heavily politicized, and there's a lot of, the AIDS crisis comes about and a lot of representation, and then it kind of made me look at pictures of gay pride, now and then, and I just noticed this, and it's a one of the first striking things is the visuality of it, and that's what I referred to at the beginning of hypervisuality. It's the idea of it seems to be a lot more about, especially selfie culture and the image and pride, like Manchester Pride that's happening now. It seems it's a lot based on how you look and how you project that look, and that kind of made me want to really ask you about. So like we've got dating apps like Grindr and Tinder. And social media, which I think is a huge hyper-capitalist. You cultivate and you sell yourself constantly, and you're a marketing, curator and whatever. But how do you feel about the social media and Grindr and Tinder and stuff, and how do you think that's affected what we're talking about?
No, I'm kind of in tune with the representation that you just described, really, about, I guess it's what Foucault would call the kind of, or Foucauldian thinkers would refer to as a kind of the neoliberal project, isn't it, in terms of how the self is produced in this particular cultural space, how to produce yourself as an acceptable version of a gay man or a middle-aged gay man, perhaps. So I think the discursibility is definitely there, isn't it? And it's certainly in terms of the hyper. I mean, I'd agree with all of this, really. And I think if I were to, I must fess up and say that. Remember, I did my field work back in 2008, 2009, and I wrote 2010, 2000. Well, I wrote up the PhD 2010, 2011. And the book appeared in 2015. It was kind of updated, but if I were to go back to the experience now, one thing I would really have to reckon with is this shift of the scene.
Smartphones,
from bar-based to people now very often. Let's dispense with the bar and let's just hook up through a website. Here's my apps. This is what I look like. Here's my torso shot. Here's my cock shot. Take your pick. Let's meet up at come round to mine at midnight, 2, 3 in the morning. Instant kind of sex kind of thing. So the scene has shifted, and we hear of bars in London closing down, and it certainly happened in Manchester's gay village as well. I think.
Oh really? Oh.
I think one or two. Mind you, they do tend to kind of revive or reappear in a kind of another way. But this was all, I think, beginning to happen. But the pandemic may have had some kind of effect on people congregating or getting together and having hookups or threesomes or moresomes or orgies or whatever. One assumes that may be. There's been some caution around that because of the pandemic. But yeah, all of what you describe is all of the above kind of apply, really, isn't it? It's a pretty kind of reductive way of valuing bodies, isn't it? And even though bodies tend to be fragmented, it's still about how more youthful bodies, even in a fragmented way, are shown, as in the nice abs, the nice chest. But I think it also goes back to ageism still very much affects, is imbrued within this particular development of the gay cultural scene. And I get earlier on, I referred to the online disinhibition effect. And again, this is where middle-aged and older gay men may find themselves even more rudely and sharply kind of rejected with abuse on top, and again, these effects tend to dehumanize, to marginalize, to alienate. Again, very much on the grounds of aging. But again, I come back to let's not all go too far. Yes, it happens. It's a dominant story, but let's not go too far down that misery story, because there is agency in online profiles, in
Yes.
how men express themselves, how men articulate through a profile, a more authentic, self-valuing, middle-aged subjectivity, if you like. Yeah, I mean, there's I, not only do middle-aged gay men have the resources to be able to critique the fragmentation, the youth-oriented nature of Grindr and hookup sites and the online scene, and so on, but and some will avoid it. You know, they will say, right, okay, I've had a look on there. I'm going elsewhere. I'd rather go to a social group or social support group where I know that ageism is going to be a little bit less acute. Or remember that, you know, older middle-aged gay men can use the resources of aging and other forms of capital to create their own websites, to create their own web pages that, you know, that are more age friendly, or where age does not matter, where it fades into that, or even, you know, where I said earlier, where wrinkles might be signified as erotic and sexy and valuable. Again, I think this is where Bourdieu's notion of kind of fields of existence came into play in my research, isn't it? Because, you know, as a younger man, you can wander into some spaces and find that your younger body is not actually the desirable thing. It may be on the scene more generally, or in particularly youth-coded spaces. But I mean, I went into a bears space. Now, bears do tend to be a little bit older, a bit fatter, a bit hairier. They don't shave themselves. It's a different form. It's a more, perhaps a genetic form of embodiment, because they're saying, look, I'm big, I'm fat, I'm older, I'm hairier. All the things that are not de rigueur on the scene at the moment, with smooth, shaved, youthful, athletic bodies. I'm anything but that, but I'm still sexy. You know, get over it, you know, or admire me. I'm worthy of the gay gaze still, kind of thing. And I you know, I'm relatively slim. I went into that kind of space, and I became invisible. You know, quite rightly, because that was what men were going for. They were going to meet bigger men, or that was the kind of name of the game, I suppose. But nonetheless, it tells you you've got differently coded spaces that have been forged and created and recreated, where different forms of embodiment are valued, that are older, fatter, and would have less currency on the mainstream or conventional in certain spaces of the gay scene. So, you know, it's about that creative endeavour where older and some younger gay men who find them erotic, you know, find the daddy figure. Let's not forget that, you know, the thing about daddies at the moment. You know, Freudians would have a field day, and it's great to open that up a bit more, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But it nonetheless you know, whenever you think of that, it nonetheless tells us that whilst there is this dominant narrative, and there are these gay approved forms of embodiment, there's a lot more. You know, if you open the net and start to look, if you've got the optics, if you've got the eyes to see, the tools, theoretical tools that enable critique, it enables you to open up a wider vista of bodies that are valued in different spaces and in different ways and kind of for different reasons. So opening that up, really, I think, might come as some relief to people who are worried about getting older, maybe. You know, that there is space still. There is agency, there's critique from some unexpected quarters as well. You know, not just the educated people who know a lot about Foucault and post-structuralism, not just sociologists and social scientists and cultural theorists and historians, but a lot of very ordinary people, I think, have used the resources of aging to develop critique of this limited view of the valid, sexy body. It's got to be youthful, slim, athletic, toned, hairless, or whatever, you know, whatever those bodies are. There are alternatives to that, and there are people who are really bigging up and valuing those alternatives. It's about where you look and finding those spaces that where such bodies are revalued.
Yeah, it's about where you look. I think that's a good title for a paper or another monograph, maybe. It's about where you look. Yeah, just aware of time now. We've got a couple of minutes left, but yeah, I think it's quite nice there to end on a really positive, recuperative note. You know, especially the idea of it doesn't stop at 40, 50, 60, 70. I got scrambled together some statistics before this interview. And you know, I read somewhere there's 1.9 million non-heterosexual queer identified people over 50
Yeah.
at the moment, and it really it just makes you realize, like, you know, just because a certain section is restricted in terms of its coverage in the media, you know, maybe we shouldn't trust what we see as much, and you know, we should question things a bit more. And I think especially maybe 25 plus is when you start. I remember I, on my own journey, started to sort of be a bit more critical of what I saw online, or a bit more skeptical of not all gay men are like this, not all bisexual men are like this, and you know, everything else. So I guess it's always good to end on a positive. And on that note, I think maybe the last thing is, if there's anything that you would say to anyone that was, you know, outside of academia and Foucault and stuff, anyone who was concerned about aging, ageism, you know, oh, I'm getting old, you know, that's me done. Like, what would you say on a sort of more personal level, I guess?
Okay. I think if I could say a few personal things, but just a couple of
Oh, yeah.
academic.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's no easy remedy for this big social division within gay culture. You know, I think we have to kind of try and live with some of the tensions that it actually throws up, and try and be as critical as we can about them. And I mean, sorry, you said, you know, ignoring Foucault, but Foucault, you know, says you cannot overturn discourse. We become meaningful through discourse. You can't overthrow power, can you? Power can be kind of productive, and I think that's a kind of important point, really, because I think, you know, if we can learn to live with some of the tensions and learn to critique them, and learn to kind of try and reach beyond to develop more convivial relationships, that would be a kind of useful start, really. But I also think that maybe voluntary organisations could be doing something. I know they've begun, like the LGBT Foundation, that, well, it's located in Manchester, but it now covers the country, doesn't it? It's not just Northwest anymore. But they have begun to focus on aging in I think quite a productive way, really. But we need to continue with this kind of project, really, to try and forge more convivial relations and forms of understanding between the differently aged gay men, really. So, but you know, it's not just the voluntary side. I think pubs and clubs could be doing something. You know, I hesitate to kind of lay down the law or make perhaps more concrete suggestions, but I do think they could be doing more to the kind of, you know, in terms of challenging ageist attitudes, and perhaps, you know, at least encouraging people to think about a broader form of acceptance, really, and that's how we might live and kind of living together. So. Yeah, I think that the gay commercial scene, it takes from us, it takes an awful lot, and it profits from us in all sorts of ways. That would be one way of kind of giving something back, wouldn't it? By perhaps uniting even with the voluntary sector to do something about forging a more convivial relations between older and younger gay men. I also think of strategic separatism. Doesn't harm, really, because one of the common choruses and the common themes amongst the gay men I interviewed was that it's actually sometimes nice to have downtime and to be amongst peers, same age peers, who you don't have to explain things to. They will remember what it was like to have grown up in a more hostile age. They will remember the vicissitudes, the challenges of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and the neocon attack on LGBT lives back in the 80s, from the right, well, from the Tory, the mainstream of the Tory party, Thatcherism of the time. So there's a kind of need for strategic separatism as a means of understanding and developing, if you like, personal and political resources to be able to fight back. But not as an end in itself. I want greater relations with younger people. I want to be more inclusive, but I don't know. It might be easy for me to say on a personal level with hindsight. I'm now 63. I've written a book on it. It was hugely therapeutic, and I've got the sociological and theoretical tools at my disposal to enable me to be critical and to have that understanding and to deconstruct and unpack gay ageism and make it much less fearful. And it really did work in that way. That's the advantage of having that form of cultural capital, these intellectual tools, really. But remember also that when I look back, I think now that the age, the concern about growing older does actually come more from younger people, because when you get there, you hit 30 and it was fearful. You get to 30, you think, what's the problem? I'm okay, it's fine, I like me. I've grown a bit, so positive things have happened, I've hit 40, my God, the world hasn't collapsed. 50, then 60, and I'm thinking I'm still here, it's not so bad, life has improved. For me, but we need to think about positioning as well. We need to think about intersectionality, don't we? That I may be able to say this because I've perhaps become middle class through education. I've not no financial worries as an academic who might even be looking at early retirement. People working class gay men who are isolated. Maybe neurodiverse or have disabilities, who find their rejection even more complete, or would be talking from a very different position. So my position is by no means universal. I think we have to recognise the variety of speaking positions or positionality, isn't it? That's what I'm talking about. But remember though that if you've seen rejection, the scene is the tip of the iceberg. In terms of our gay and other lives, it may. I think as you get older, I've begun to appreciate it's not the be all and the end all. And to be honest, it's nice there are maybe nice things to being relieved from the pressure of the gay gaze, the harsh gay. Even when I was young, and athletic, my body still wasn't good enough. No matter how much work I did on it, I mean, it still wasn't, and we can go down that road, can't we? But as I've said, as I've hinted, there are spaces both online, in social and support groups, even on the scene, where older gay men they've carved out particular spaces where older bodies are valued and resignified and seen as erotic and valuable even in a more kind of holistic way. So and how people spoke about the value of making that transition in terms of kinship that was largely experienced on the gay scene. My gay friends who I go out for a drink with and go clubbing with, making that kind of transition to that alternative family, more domestically staged, was hugely significant, and they begun to appreciate it. And it wasn't just a recompense. A lot of men were saying, well, I realised this is something better. I'm more valued. I'm more intrinsically valued here. It's less of a ball ache. It's less of a challenge, really. So maybe the focus, because we're on self-presentation or pressures around self-presentation become a little bit less acute as you kind of age, and the resources of aging that we tend to accumulate through hard knocks, through experience of all kinds of relationships and all kinds of different spheres of existence. It all has an effect, and it does enable a lot of people to really to rethink and to give some kind of purchase and understanding as you get older. And again, as I said, it's the it's the basis of the resources of aging that are a prerequisite to critiquing and having a healthier stance towards the pressures of gay ageism. So yeah, so it's not all. You begin to realise, I think, as you get older, that aging is not a personal failing.
Mm.
And I know on one level, Botox and facelifts and the ease of plastic surgery these days, of cosmetic surgery to look younger and better. It has become cheaper and within the means of more and more people. But I hear Terry Eagleton's view back in the 90s that his view was that plastic surgery, particularly caught on in America, was really about an American inability to face mortality. And there's something in that. That's why we fear aging. It reminds us that we're getting closer towards social and actual
death.
might be psychologically underneath.
Yeah.
So terrifying. But the neoliberal pressures to produce yourself as to stay as young looking for as long as you can. These your wrinkles and your aging and your putting on weight is not a personal failing, but what's going on is really the awful pressures of the awful discourses, that neoliberal discourses, to produce yourself in this approved way that I think need a thorough unpacking, or at least we have to negotiate with them.
I think there's a lot to be said as well about, everyone has access to these opportunities that can make you better. You should take them. I think that's quite factors in. Like, it's here, it's your job to improve yourself in that neoliberalist attitude. Something like, you can buy, I think it's Hims hair loss that keeps coming up on my feed, and things like this. So, yeah. And I heard my sister's, she's 19, and she talks about, Snapchat filters and the surgery that you can get that can make you look like yeah. I'm going to just kind of wrap things up now, just in terms of time. Just wanted to express my gratitude and thank you so much for talking about that stuff. I'm sure a lot of people that, like, when this gets uploaded, it'll resonate with, and and I think just all the work you do is really super important. I was gonna use the opportunity to plug your book, which is it Palgrave Macmillan. People should, everybody should buy that. It's really, really good. Buy it twice. Are you on social media? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. I think anything else beyond that, and it becomes a little bit addictive, doesn't it? You get a little bit. I have to try and ration. Social media. It's so easy to get sucked in.
It is. Right, Paul. Thank you so much for your time and for preparing those answers. I'm going to just stop recording, and on behalf of myself and Queerlins, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. Cheers, Chris. Okay.